Hi, and welcome to this video from the statistics section of the course, and in this one we're going to be looking at collecting data and the different ways we can do that. I'm particularly looking at different terms that you need to be familiar with, look at the advantages and disadvantages, different types of sampling methods, and then finally we'll have a brief chat about the large data set. So, off we go then. So the first thing we've got to think about is, if we're going to collect some data, are we going to take a census or are we going to take a sample? And there's a very big difference between those two things. First things first, so kind of the key term here is the population. And the population is the whole set of items that are of interest. So, for example, if I wanted to find out about school meals in a school and what students thought of them, then my population would be the students within the school. Now, if I'm going to find out about that population, I've got to make a decision. Am I going to ask absolutely everybody so I get a completely accurate picture of what's going on, or do I just ask a smaller group and assume that that group is going to be representative of the whole population? And that's basically the thing at the top. So it says census versus a sample. A census is something where we observe or measure every single member of the population. So in my school dinners example, I would go and talk to every single member or every single student in the school. And already I imagine you can start thinking about why there might be advantages or disadvantages to doing that. The alternative to a census is a sample, where what I do is just take a selection of observations from a small group within the school, but don't ask absolutely everybody, and then I use the information from that sample to say, okay, that's generally going to tell us about the whole population. So that's the idea behind census and sample. Now, let's just quickly run through advantages and disadvantages. So a census is going to give you a completely accurate result because you're asking everybody. But the problem you've got, obviously, is if it's time consuming. If it's a big school, it's going to take a long time. How do I actually get access to every single member of the school and all those kind of things? So it's time consuming, expensive, sometimes can't be done. And the other key one here is it can't be done when the testing process destroys the item. What I mean by that is, imagine you wanted to find out, let's say, about the quality of chocolate bars. And so you've got a production process, and in order to test the chocolate bars, you're just going to open them and have a bite. Well, clearly, having a bite out of a chocolate bar, if you test every single item, you'll now have no chocolate bars left to sell. So that's going to be no good at all. So in that sense, you wouldn't be able to do a census. And the other thing is, if you've got a huge amount of data, then it sometimes becomes more logistically difficult to process that. But I've got to be honest, in this day and age, when we're talking about kind of large amounts of data and computer processing power, that one is not so much of an issue. But alongside the whole idea of time-consuming and expensive, the other big issue is that last one there, which it might not be possible to get responses from every single person. Imagine sending out, for example, you say, okay, we're going to do this as an online questionnaire. You wouldn't necessarily get every single person responding to that. If you want to go around the school and ask everybody, it might be people away. You don't find certain people, and so on and so forth. So there's logistical issues about being able to get hold of information from every single person or item within the population. Right, so if we're saying that there's disadvantages to a census, then our alternative would say, well, we're going to decide to do a sample. And clearly, for a sample, you're asking a smaller group, so it's less time consuming, less expensive. You've got fewer people who have to respond, and you've got less data to process. So kind of the reverse of the disadvantages of the census. And having said that, disadvantages of a sample, well, you've got to make sure that your sample, I've mentioned it a couple of times before, is kind of representative of your population. We'll talk a little bit later on about how you might do that. So it might be that your sample may not give you accurate data, and particularly there's issues surrounding sample size. There's potential for bias to be introduced. So if you're only asking certain groups of pupils, for example, or you go out and randomly select people, it might be you inevitably end up with more, for example, younger students and older students. But then finally, the major issue, I think, is this one, which is it might be that the sample might not be large enough to give you an accurate enough representation of the population. Let's say your school's got 1,000 people in it, and you decide to ask 20. Do those 20 really represent the views of the whole population? Now, another couple of terms you need to be aware of. Sampling units, that's like individual units of a population. So, for example, if we keep going with my survey about school meals, it might be the sampling unit would be year 7s or year 8s or year 9s, or the staff, so different groups within the population. And then a sampling frame is effectively a way of being allocated a number to each member of a sampling unit. So, for example, if you've got a list of all your year 7s, you might assign a number 1 to, 100 for each person in that group, and that would be the thing that enables you then to choose which people you're going to ask. And we'll look at those kind of ideas in a second. So if we've decided that a sample is what we're going to do, how do we then go about deciding which people from each section of the population that we're going to choose. So here we go. So we've got some sampling methods, and the first one is this idea of random sampling. Now, you'll be familiar with the word random, but in the context of sampling, it's got a very specific meaning, and it means that every item in the population has an equal chance of being selected. Right, so we can do this in a couple of ways. So a simple sample is just using a random number generator, and you've got one of those on your calculator, so you need to have a look at how you could use a random number generator and which key it is on your calculator. And that just spits out a number, and you can set it to pick numbers within a certain range. And or alternatively, lottery sampling, which is, we take each number, put them in a hat, and then just pick names out of the hat. So that would be a simple sample. You've then got a systematic sample, where you take each person in from an ordered list, and you take them at regular intervals. So, for example, I get my list of all my year 7s, and I take every 5th person, or I take every 8th person, or however many years I decide that I need. And then finally, we've got stratified sampling. So what we're going to do is take the population, divide it up into our groups or sampling units. So, for example, again, year 7s, year 8s, year 9s. And then let's say that my year 7s are a much bigger year group than, for example, the 6th form. Then I'd decide to take more year 7s. So if 40% of the school was year 7s, 40% of my sample would be year 7s. If only 10% of the school was 6th form, I'd only have 10% of my sample being 6th form. And so in order to do that, we just do a simple calculation, which is you just work out the proportion, as I've just said, and then times it by how many people you want in your sample. So if I wanted a sample of 50 people, and I've got, let's say, 40% of them want to be year 7s, I'd be doing 40% times by 50. On we go. So let's just have a look at a quick example. So here we go. A lecturer wants feedback on a lecture, and she's got a list of all the 160 people who attended, and she wants 30 people to fill in a questionnaire. So how would she do it? So using a simple random sample, all we'd do is just allocate a number from 1 to 160 for each member of the audience. Then you'd get your calculator and you'd use your random number generator to generate numbers between 1 and 160, and you just kind of keep pressing the button until it spat out 30 different numbers. And then all you do is just compare those numbers to the list and pick the relevant numbers, pick the relevant people. Right. On we go. If we're going to do a systematic sample, well, we've got 160 people in the audience. We want a sample of 30. So that means we're going to need to choose pretty much every 5th person. Now we've got to decide who's the first person I'm going to pick. So the first thing I'm going to do is generate a random number between 1 and 5. That's going to identify my first person. So for example, if we get 3 as our first number, the 3rd person on my list will be the first person to choose. And then I'm going to choose every 5th person after that. So that'll be person number 8, person number 13. And so on and so forth. Okay, so that's a quick example of a simple random sample and systematic sample. Let's have a look now at a stratified sample. So there we go. We've got some students who go to Brighton. They're going to go to different locations in Brighton. So we've got the aquarium, the wheel, and the Royal Pavilion. And we've got it split into male and female. So the teacher wants to take a sample of 40 students, and we want to take that sample based on where they went and what gender they were. So what we're going to do is we'll work out a number of students in the sample who are female and went to the Brighton wheel. So female and went to the Brighton wheel. So there's our formula. So female and Brighton wheel, there's the 35 out of the 148 went to that location and were female. So we want 35 out of the 148. So that's the proportion of students that we're interested in from that group. And then simply I've got to times that by 40. And so what I'm going to do is choose, let's say 9.45, but I'm not going to choose 0.45 of a student, so it's going to be either 9 or 10 people to go into that sample. Okay, so we've seen a couple of examples. Let's have a quick run through the advantages and disadvantages of each method. So advantages to simple random sampling: it's free of bias, it's easy and cheap to do, and obviously we said random, so everybody's got an equal chance of being selected. At the same time, it might not be representative of the whole population if you've got different amounts of different kind of people, as I said before about, can you imagine having more year 7s, for example, in the 6th form. And you're going to need a sampling frame, so you're going to need that list of names. Systematic sampling, very simple. It's simple and quick to use and works well for large samples, large populations. And again, the problem is it needs a sampling frame, and it can introduce bias if that sampling frame is not random. Stratified sampling is the one that gives you a much more accurate reflection of the population depending on the sampling units within that, so it guarantees proportional representation of groups within the population. But the problem is you've got to have clear, distinct groups, which is doable, but it's just an extra job you've got to do. Right. We mentioned random sampling. Now on to non-random sampling. Two versions here. First one being quota sampling, where an interviewer just selects a sample that reflects the characteristics of the whole population, just goes out and just selects people depending on certain characteristics. Or opportunity sampling, which is you just go somewhere, for example, you might just select the first 10, 15, 20 people, however many you need, at a certain location. Advantages and disadvantages. Well, the quota sampling, it's easy to carry out, it's inexpensive, but it's unlikely to provide a representative sample, and it's highly dependent on who's doing the questioning. So if somebody's making a judgment about age groups, for example, or it might be you want to question people and somebody might be influenced by how different people look or so on. And for opportunity sampling, the advantages are it allows a small sample still to be representative of the population. We don't need a sampling frame. It's easy, quick, inexpensive to do, and allows for an easy comparison between different groups of the population. And the disadvantages, again, we can introduce bias and increasing the scope of the study, increase the number of groups, which means it gets more time consuming and expensive. Okay. Right, last couple of sections that we need to get through. Firstly is to do with characteristics of data. Different types of data have different characteristics. So we've got qualitative, which is non-numerical data. So for example, if you're doing a survey and you wanted to find out about hair colour, for example, like blonde, brown, black, ginger, whatever, those would be qualitative, non-numerical, because they're words. And obviously the other version of that is the quantitative, which is the one that is numerical data. Within numerical quantitative data, you've got two types of data, which is continuous, where your data can take any value in a given range. So for example, you consider measurements, for example, height. You might, somebody can be 153 centimetres, 153.2, 153.27, depending on how accurate you want to be. So it can take absolutely any value at all, as opposed to discrete. So for example, if we were counting, if we were doing something about like the number of people in a class, you can have 20 people in the class, you can have 25 people in the class, you can't have 24.3 people in a class. So discrete can only take certain values, whereas continuous data can take any value at all. Group data, that's just when all the data is just put into groups. So for example, you'll be familiar with tables that look like that, where we've got weights and the data's all been collated into groups. So you don't know the actual value for each individual piece of data, but for example, there's 8 pieces of data within that particular group. And the final thing to mention is the large data set. Now, the large data set is the medium via which a lot of statistics are going to be taught in order to try and make it kind of the stuff that you're doing relevant. And each different exam board has different large data sets. I work at the moment with Edexcel Pearson, and they've chosen to use meteorological data. So this last bit, I'm just going to talk very briefly about that. If you're not an Edexcel person, then you just want to make sure you know exactly what the large data set it is for the exam board that you're doing. But let's say, regardless of exam board, the stats questions will be based upon extracts from the large data set, and in the case of Pearson, it's meteorological data. And regardless of exam board, you need to be familiar with the ins and outs of that data set. Now, I'm not talking about memorising all the data. What I am talking about is just being aware of where the data comes from, what kind of time frame, how it was calculated, what the units are within each one, and so on and so forth. So you just need to have an understanding of the large data set, because you are going to get asked contextual questions that require some knowledge of the data set. And for Edexcel, let's say it's weather data, so we've got some data from the UK taken from 5 different places, and then you've got some international data that's taken from Jacksonville, Florida, Beijing in China, Perth. And so, for example, with regard to Edexcel, they're expecting you to understand that if we're looking at data for weather and its temperature, the temperature in Camborne and Hirth in the south of the country would potentially be higher than maybe in Scotland in Lucius, where you might expect higher winds. And by the same token, on the international data, we've clearly got Jacksonville and Beijing that are in the northern hemisphere, so summer will be in the months of May, June, July, August, whereas during those months, Perth is in the southern hemisphere, so that's winter. So it's just that kind of understanding about what's going on. And again, for the Pearson Edexcel data, they're very particularly chosen, particularly in 1987, which you may or may know about. There's a link to the video. I'm not going to play that, but if you just go online, and I'll leave you to Google this one for yourself. If you just Google Big Storm 1987, and particularly a weatherman who became very famous, a guy called Michael Fish, whack those into YouTube, and you'll see exactly why Edexcel chose octets at that time period from 1987 to use for their data. Okay, that's kind of Edexcel stuff. Obviously, there'll be equivalent for OCR, AQA, WJEC, but you just need to make sure you're familiar with whichever one it is that you're using.